So as you can see, I've snapped the axle to my front diff. So this video is going to be on replacing my front diff and swapping over my diff locker into the new diff. So that's the snapped axle there, it just tore itself. Didn't look like it damaged anything else in the diff, but just to be safe I'm swapping the whole lot over. This is my old diff carrier with the locker in it, and here's the new diff. So we're just going to start by pulling off the front cover. So I skipped the diff removal just because I thought it was pretty straightforward and it'd save a bit of time. Just make sure that you got a mate handy to give you a lift down, it's pretty heavy, and just make sure that you disconnect the diff breather before you pull it down. We're just going to start by pulling off this side axle and opening up the front cover. That little piece there was the little short axle. Once you undo those two little bearing carriers which hold up the diff center, you can just pull it out, wriggle it to the side, it'll come out pretty easily. We're just going to start by dropping the crown. The crown bolts are the ones on the outside, and the diff center ones are the ones on the inside. From memory, the sockets that you'll need to work your way through the diff are a 17 and a 14 and I think a 12, and that should be all you need to work your way through the whole diff. I don't think there are any others. So we'll just open up this diff center now, and this is the new diff. So this one will have your spider gears, your sun gears. There's no locker mechanism in there yet, and we'll just put that off to the side. Here's my old diff center that has a locker in it, so we'll just crack that open. So here's my diff center. There's part of the axle snapped off in it, but this side looks pretty clean. Just trying to crack it open. There's part of the locker mechanism. Just pulling it apart and inspecting it because I wasn't sure how much of the diff was damaged, but it looks like all that broke was the axle and everything else seemed to be pretty functional. These are the springs that you'll need for later. Make sure you keep track of those. And here's the cross pin that holds the spider gears. This piece was a little bit stuck because this holds the snapped axle, and it sort of churned up a bit of diff and got stuck together. There's a little bit of damage on this carrier. That won't be able to be reused, I don't think, and it's not really worth fixing. It'll probably just go to scrap. There I'm tapping out the snapped axle that was in the locker mechanism, but all the splines on that looked fine. There wasn't any damage, it was all on the axle shaft. Here's the broken axle. So here's the locker cam gear with a shim on it, and you pull these shims off your sun gears out of your open diff and put it onto the locker. Here's the sun gear with the axle lock nut. You'll have to punch that out. Here it is in the locker component. You'll need to push it out of the spline and fit it to the locker. The locker itself is very easy to fit. It's more so the tolerances that take the time. You really want to get them right and to the specifications that Lokka gives you. That's all in the instructions, but really just follow the tolerances they give you and make sure everything's got the right clearance that they specify. Another helpful trick is to be very familiar with all the diff parts, because you'll be pulling it apart and putting it back together quite a few times to do all the checks and testing tolerances that Lokka wants you to do. So here I am fitting it without the springs, and now I'm checking tolerances on the spider gear or the cross pin between the locker spacer. And on the other side too, between the spacer and the cross pin again. And here we're piecing together all the locker parts in the diff, and we're going to check the tolerances again. So these are the little pins that hold the springs, and the springs go between the two locker cam gears that are separated by the cross pin. So there are two more pins there. Each side has two pins, and they sort of interlock between each other. So now we're going to put the springs in. I found it was easiest to put the springs inside of the locker component rather than try and balance them on the pins and sort of aim them into the other side of the Lokka cam gear. And so that diff is now fitted with the Lokka, everything's done, and you just need to double check clearances once these bolts have a bit of pressure on them, pulling the diff together. So it's really quite simple. It's not overly complex, it's more so just knowing that you can measure the tolerance and check the clearances properly. And now I'm just checking that the springs are in properly using a screwdriver to make sure that they're not half hanging out or anything. And they look alright. So you could follow manufacturer specifications, go to Nissan and check what torques they want, but I just use the rattle gun. If you're going to use Loctite, make sure that it's oil tolerant. So we're just putting a little dab on each of the crown gear ones and just doing them up finger tight. Make sure that if you're going to use a rattle gun, get the bolt started before you hit it, otherwise you'll just strip threads, and that's not exactly what you want in a diff especially. Now we're getting the rattle gun onto them, and you just want to follow similar technique to lug nuts, just moving a circle pattern or a crisscross, going opposite side to opposite side until you make your way around, and that'll pull it in evenly. Just go around one last time, make sure everything's done up. So this is the bearing carrier, or what holds your diff up. And you're just going to give it a quick wipe, and make sure you use a little bit of oil when you're fitting these. The rubber seals, you definitely don't want to pinch them, otherwise you'll get a leak. And I just use a little bit of diff oil, nothing special. So I rubbed a little bit of oil around the metal part, and there's an O-ring, I lubed that up a bit as well, and then around the rubber seal as well. Just give them a light tap in. These are directional, these seals, they have a little arrow pointing on them. I didn't look where the arrow was pointing, I just lined up the bolt holes because I'm pretty sure they can only go in one way. But if you like, you can line up the arrow or just line up the bolt holes, either way. So just doing up these bolts that hold in the axle seals, and just be very careful with the rattle gun. I'm pretty sure that they're only aluminium, so don't do them up too tight. Now what we're going to do is check the diff backlash. Just going to mount this on here, and you'll be able to see, you want to hold the pinion and just try and rock the diff back and forth. You're not trying to spin the diff, you're trying to feel the clearance between the pinion and the crown. It all checked out. There was barely any on this second-hand diff, which is great. And now we're just going to put the case back on. So just zap it in with the rattle gun real quick. Now this is the short axle. We just want to clean that seal, put a little bit of oil on it, lube it up so that we don't tear it. And we're just going to spin it around until you feel the splines match up, and give it a little gentle tap. It's only held in by one bolt, so we'll put a little bit of Loctite on that. Once again, oil tolerant, make sure that it'll suit the application, and just tighten it up with the rattle gun. Here we're scraping off the old sealant from the axle tube. Just going to give a little bit of a clean up so that we can get a nice surface for the new sealant. Now this isn't anything special, I think it's just RTV gasket maker or something, but when you're picking a gasket maker, just consider the application. Your front diff's right under the engine, so it could be copping a little bit of heat, and the front diff also makes a little bit of heat in itself, so just make sure that the heat rating on it is suitable. We're just going to drop this axle back on, do up the bolts. One other thing to remember is you don't want to fill it with oil while there's still wet sealant in there. You don't want to ruin the seal that you just put in there. Just let it dry before you fill the oil up. So I think I let mine sit for a couple of hours, it wasn't that long. And now we're putting on, this is a PSR diff drop. So this cross member is a little bit different to what a stock one would look like, but the factory is the same with offset bushes in it. So this back piece will look the same. If you're interested in why the diff broke, I'd assume that it was caused by CV bind. I was lifted up pretty high, and just in combination with the diff lock, just puts a bit of stress on the diff itself. But I'm surprised that it wasn't a CV that broke, but it is what it is. I've dropped the ute down, so now it won't do that again, hopefully. And here's the final product. You can see everything spins, especially when you spin the pinion. They both spin at the same speed, which is what you want. So that's the end of the video. If you have any questions or suggestions, just use the comment section. Thanks.